these things are so important for technology. They're so important for AI. People are so edgy about this because there's so much money in it, and it's so important to the global supply chain. And as I looked into it more and more and more, I think this is the story of oil in the 21st century.
Everybody agrees that we need to decarbonize. We need to reduce the use of fossil fuels in the global economy and move to clean energy like solar and wind. The cornerstone technology for all of that is lithium-ion batteries because, of course, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind isn't always blowing. However, despite the insistence on the necessity of that shift and the much needed and welcome benefits of these technologies, we don't really know, we don't even really care to ask, where they come from or the minerals inside them. That's the conversation we're having today on Downstream, because lithium-ion batteries are in your laptop, in your phone, increasingly in your car. And yes, of course, they're made in China, but actually the core components in them almost always come from Africa, almost always from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And serious questions should be raised about how that happens, how those supply chains actually work. Are these technologies, when it comes down to it, even dirtier than fossil fuels? There's a provocation for you. And was there an ideological assertion in the early 2000s of the economy becoming increasingly immaterial that actually reflected a profound alienation from production, industry, and manufacturing? Was that all, dare I say, an ideological assertion? Hugely important conversation, not least because with the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, people are increasingly turning to electric vehicles, solar panels, and lithium-ion batteries. But like I say, where's all that stuff coming from? Who is mining it? And what do their lives look like? All core to a new book, The Elements of Power by Nicolas Niarchos, a story of war technology, and in his words, the dirtiest supply chain on Earth. Nick, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're here to talk about your fabulous book, The Elements of Power. Let me get it up. It's a beautiful cover as well. The story of war technology and the dirtiest supply chain on Earth. More about that line in a minute, the dirtiest supply chain on Earth, because I think that will really unsettle some people, particularly those invested in the renewable agenda. Let me start with this. iPhone 17. Sorry, I like to be up to date with these things. My contract ran out. That's the real reason. It's the latest iPhone. What minerals are in this phone and where do they come from?
You've got cobalt, you've got lithium, you've got tantalum, and the vast majority of those minerals come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The lithium probably comes from, the lithium mines of the Democratic Republic of the Congo are very, very rich as well, although they haven't been exploited. Now, the iPhone 17 has a lot of recycled minerals in it. So there is a question about, did they come from somebody's phone beforehand? But even so, those minerals will have originally been dug out of the ground in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
So you say that there's recycled cobalt in the iPhone 17?
Yeah, they say there is.
Just taking Apple, are they becoming a more responsible company with this stuff over time because the issue of mining and where these resources are coming from is becoming more salient for their customers?
I would say that it's much more to do with cost than anything else. I mean, I think that's they all say that it's to do with responsible mining and so on. I mean, the fact is that the big Amnesty International report on sort of wage slavery and human rights abuses in artisanal mining. This is artisanal mining is a kind of euphemism that is used by industry to describe people who are basically digging out these materials by hand, and you see this on the side of the road in the DRC, and you see people terrible.
You see the mining of cobalt by the side of a road.
Yeah, you see mainly coltan actually in a town called Monono. Cobalt, you see little children sort of taking the scraps off these mines, bags of minerals on their back. It's very, very difficult to police that, and it does not police particularly well. So this, really came to people's attention in 2016. There had been some AP reports on it in 2011 and so on that I'd found. But what happened was that the report came out, and there was a great deal of sort of, oh, where are we getting our minerals from? And Apple said, we're going to take these people out of our supply chain. Slowly but surely, the worst offenders crept back in. And by the worst offenders, I'm very happy to say it. The book focused on one of them, which is Zhejiang Cobalt, which is the parent company of CDM. So if Apple really cared about this issue, they would not have reintroduced them into the supply chain. However, cobalt is becoming more and more expensive. Last year, there was a huge shoot up in price. So they're trying to figure out other places to get it from. And unless you're Elon Musk, who figured this out very early on, as you have to have basically these very long-term contracts. And that's why Tesla was only buying from these mines with long-term contracts. And that was the only source of cobalt for a long time for them. Apple has kind of had this very mixed supply chain from early on.
How mineral rich is the Congo? I should say the Democratic Republic of Congo, sorry.
It's just incredibly mineral rich. It's probably the richest country in Africa in terms of mineral wealth, especially. But it has also, hydrocarbons. It has gas. It has oil and coal. It has everything, basically. But it is one of the world's poorest countries. And it is poor because it has been exploited thoroughly and vigorously from very, very early on, first by its own kings, and then by slave traders coming from the coast of East Africa, and then most notably and most brutally by the Belgians, and then this kind of neo-colonial sort of drift that was really sponsored by the Americans comes after decolonization in 1960.
So we'll get back to the sort of historical horrors inflicted on Congo, particularly Prince Leopold. I mean, that is, for people who know, something of a byword for the brutalities of 19th century empire. But I just want to establish, how important are these things: cobalt, lithium, nickel, tantalum? Because I think people are watching this, they might be thinking, okay, smart guy, Aaron's talking to him. I'm sure it's a very interesting book, but this is quite dry. But the reality actually is that these are so important to the world that not we're just living in, but the world we're moving into. So what technologies need this stuff?
Basically anything with a lithium-ion battery, with a rechargeable battery. But, even more than that, basically anything that you use to get around, anything that you use to communicate with. You're touching pieces of Congo every day in multiple times. And every time you pick out your smartphone, you're looking at something that would not exist were it not for the minerals of this country. Quite simply, you might be able to have a sort of brick nickel cadmium powered phone, the kind of 1980s phones. But that's really what allowed the technology to become much smaller and for batteries to last, in some cases days. It depends. I don't know what your new iPhone.
It's pretty good. I can't complain. So a lithium-ion battery, what does that look like? What does the lithium do? Why is it called iron? Where does cobalt come into it?
Lithium-ion battery is basically this scientist in the 1970s, a British scientist called Stanley Whittingham, working for Exxon, the oil company, discovers that you can create electricity by moving lithium ions. These are these subatomic particles from a lithium-containing substance across an electrolyte, which is basically a kind of either a liquid solution or in some cases it can be solid, and we can talk about solid-state batteries if you want later on, and to an anode, which is usually, at the beginning it was a lithium metal, and then we moved towards more kind of carbon. And so just think of it as a kind of porous material with all these kind of little tennis balls that sort of move across, and they're sort of zapping back and forth across the court. And every time they zap from the positive electrode to the negative, they release a charge of electricity. So that's basically how your phone powers itself. And cobalt comes into it because another brilliant scientist, this time an American scientist at the University of Oxford, figured out that the best way to construct this porous substance is to use cobalt because it maintained its integrity every time the balls left. Other substances would slowly sort of collapse into themselves. So and that's sort of what happens when your battery life starts depleting. If you've had your phone for a couple of years, that's the structure. That's this structure which contains cobalt is slowly depleting, and that's why batteries only last a certain amount of time.
So wait, when my battery on my iPhone 17 starts dying in 2 years, where it basically, the battery lasts 5 hours rather than 35 hours. Is that because the tennis balls that you just described, is that because they're moving more slowly, they're less likely to move?
Because the structures that they're moving between are less likely, are less able to hold them because they're starting to sort of fudge in on themselves. Every time you take these tennis balls out. Sorry, this has become
This is fantastic.
a metaphor which
Carry
I'm not
on.
sure if it makes sense. But every time you take these tennis balls out, they become the structure of the things that hold them, which are the cathode and the anode, slowly becomes more and more deformed. And you can see this on a kind of microscopic level. You see these little things called dendrites, which are these kind of outgrowths of the metal. And sometimes they can short circuit the battery if they hit at the wrong point, and that's when you get battery fires.
Isn't it wild that, you've just said that we're all carrying little pieces of the Congo around with us. So phones, cars, laptops, anything these days. A Dyson vacuum cleaner or a cordless vacuum cleaner. Some of these lights that we're using here, so much of it's using these lithium-ion batteries, but we are so alienated from how the basic technology works. Now, you might say, or somebody watching or listening might say, well, we've always been in that world. But I don't know. I think, in the 1950s, lots of people knew how combustion engines worked in the West. But it does feel like we're at a really exceptionally high level of alienation from how the technology works at a really mass level. I only worked out how PV cells, solar cells worked quite recently. Similar thing, actually, in terms of the movement of elements within the silicon. On cobalt, so you've said this is being mined in somewhere like Democratic Republic of Congo, not just there, but much of it. How does it get from those roadsides, for instance, or the major mines? How does that stuff get from the DRC to my phone? What does that chain look like?
A very long and winding road. But sort of right at the beginning, what happens is that the cobalt is refined to normally what happens is within Congo, it's refined into hydroxide, either at these big industrial concentrators, which are or treatment centers, which are, attached to the big industrial mines. And these are mines owned by big Chinese companies or by Glencore, which is the kind of Swiss behemoth that holds a lot of these, two of the big mines. And then in other cases, these kind of more kitchen sink kind of operations. And those are actually responsible for a lot of pollution. And you see, some of these fields next to where these more kind of, let's say, dodgy factories are pumping out minerals into the water supply, and it's just devastation. It's environmental devastation. And you basically get the hydroxide, which is this blue powder. It's the same blue as the cover of the book. And there was a debate about whether to make it cobalt blue, which is what people understand, because it's used in painting. It's been used in painting for thousands of years. And this is actually the color of cobalt hydroxide, which is this material that comes through refining. And we can talk about the supply chain for refining because it's really important, this issue. And they treat it with sulfuric acid, becomes this powder, whole bunch of different steps. And then it gets shipped usually to the port of Durban in South Africa, sometimes to Tanzania. And very recently, there's been this railway that they've reinvigorated that goes out to Lobito in Angola. This is a big push by the Americans, actually, to get it to be exported from Lobito. However, even if it's going out to Lobito, much of that is as well going to China. So these ships will go to China, to Korea, to places where it's further refined into what's called battery precursor material. That is actually the stage that I, quite honestly, was not able to see because I wasn't able to visit China for the second part of my research. I was not allowed a visa because this is seen as a very strategic business, and China controls 90% of the processing for some of these materials, up to 99% if you think about heavy rare earth metals, things like samarium, which is in the fins of a Tomahawk missile, or dysprosium, which is used in magnets and so on. These factories are sort of closely held in China, and they churn out the precursor material, and then traditionally it would be a Foxconn or something like that, which would create the actual battery that goes into the iPhone. Now that's become a bit more dispersed, and Apple has tried to move to some extent away from China. It's moving. There's some factories in Vietnam and so on. However, at that point, you get your phone fully made, and then they're shipped back out to the UK or the US or wherever the shop is, and then sold to the consumer.
So this what did you call it? Pre-battery material?
Yeah, battery precursor.
Battery precursor material. This is the stuff that is being made in China.
Yeah.
Or South Korea or whatever. And you couldn't get a visa to see this in China because maybe you were a spy?
Maybe I was a spy, yeah.
Maybe you're CIA, MI6?
Yeah.
That's quite cool, right? I quite like that,
I mean,
have a martini to celebrate.
Quite a lot of people during this book thought I was a spy, and I was, had a lot of problems reporting this book. I was kicked out of, I was detained and kicked out of Congo. I was kicked out of the Western Sahara, and so it's weird because I went into this saying I'm going to write a book about lithium-ion batteries, and everybody was like, boring.
Yeah,
and I was interviewing people about trucking essentially when I got arrested in Congo, which was the most mental part of it. But people are so edgy about this because there's so much money in it, and it's so important to the global supply chain. And as I looked into it more and more and more, this is, I think that people who've looked into it, this is the story of oil in the 21st century. These things are so important for technology. They're so important for AI. They're so important for the way that we move around the world. And yet they just have not been getting the attention that they're supposed to be getting.
Because this book is show, don't tell. I mean, I kind of got that sense, but you don't, overtly say that necessarily. But I could not agree more. I mean, for people watching, listening, go on YouTube, Google search or YouTube search Atlas Boston Dynamics robot. Now, today, of course, you get these formulaic humanoid robots that everybody's seen. They're often, the best takes of them doing somersaults are shared on social media. If you go back to the original ones of 2007-8, they're literally hooked up to the mains, right? And so again, if robotics are on a large scale, not just multi-purpose industrial robotics, but humanoid robots, if that becomes a mainstream technology, I think it probably will in some way or other. Again, that's another frontier technology that depends on lithium-ion batteries, cars, robots, drones. The picture is very obvious. And about halfway through this book, and it's a question here, but it's one of my notes. This is. There's a good argument that lithium-ion batteries are the most important technology of the first half of the 21st century. There's some way to go, obviously. But if you look at the digital revolution, laptops, mobile phones, and now EVs, robots, that seems very obvious to me. Drones.
Warfare has completely changed because of lithium-ion batteries. And you couldn't have what you're seeing Iran doing today, actually, without all this drone warfare. You couldn't have Ukraine operating against Russia without their significant drone bases, or it would happen in a very different way. I mean, lithium-ion batteries are kind of key to that part of control, fighting, killing, and it's unfortunate that such a technology that both has the power to do so much good is also doing so much harm.
But it's just true. I mean, that's a great point. It's just so disruptive in so many ways. And it is really striking, actually, how few people are that interested in it, including on the left. And again, we'll talk about that more in a moment. But these aren't really supply chains that are talked about in a mainstream sense. It's kind of like, oh, I want to virtue signal. I'll talk about mining in Congo, but actually it's much more fundamental to the global economy than that. You mentioned Chinese firms. How central are Chinese actors, firms, individuals in the mining? You've said the refining, but actually in the project of getting this stuff out of the ground in places like the DRC?
So in the case of mining, they're key. As much as the Trump administration wants to tell you not, and now the Trump administration will tell you, or they were telling me the other day, that, well, we only want to have part of the mining and we just want to have our part. And, I mean, it's a nice thing to tell oneself. But what is just overwhelmingly obvious is that you see that the Chinese are in, I forget how many, but something like 17 of the 22 mines in southern DRC. It's just mostly Chinese. Artisanal mining, again, which is this handheld mining, basically, that 20% is almost all controlled by the Chinese these days. And you have, industrial mining is very much as well controlled by them. So I would say they are key to the mining, the refining, and the production.
You say in the book there's maybe 100,000 Chinese living in the DRC.
That's an estimate that people give you when you're there. Who knows?
You think it may be more?
I would be surprised if it's much more, but there are a lot. And, even though they really keep to themselves as communities, they're on their mines or in their businesses and so on, you realize that there are a lot of them, even just from watching people driving past in cars and so on.
Yeah. There's one moment where you say there are some young kids in Congo and they call you Chinese.
Yeah, exactly.
Because those are the only foreigners they've ever seen.
Exactly. It's a strange thing. You go into a village and you just have a bunch of sort of Congolese children running behind you saying "Chinois, Chinois." Anyway, but it's also the case in other parts of Africa. But in Congo, it's particularly prevalent, and it's just because China really stepped in. I mean, in many ways, nobody. You're saying people on the left don't care, and there's a certain level of apathy. But people across the political spectrum just did not care about this stuff. It was, as a sort of brain trust, it was so underinvested in on the sort of governmental level, on the kind of intellectual level as well. And the Chinese came in and they invested in these mines and they bought these mines, and there was no impediment to them doing so because nobody else really minded. I mean, there were some, Glencore obviously minded about their mine, and they didn't want any more exposure, so they weren't going to go and buy these big mines in central Katanga, and the American companies just saw it as a risk. So I think that as much as you want to criticize China, and you can talk about labor practices, you can talk about price setting, you can talk about all these things, which are all important. They're important points. The fact is that they went there, they put the money in the ground, they built the supply chain. And to suddenly think that, if you're Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whatever it is, you can click your fingers and everybody's going to sort of drop what they were doing and go and join American companies and so on. I think that's a bit short-sighted because there was a lot of investment. There's a lot of work that's been put in, and I think people understand that.
But where does that come from? Because you talk about China, 100,000 plus Chinese in the country now. You talk about China really from around 2000, targeting, and I don't mean that in a malicious way, there was clearly a big strategic decision made by both private enterprise and the state. Where one ends and one starts is a good question. And there's clearly a realization that this is going to be a very important technology, lithium-ion batteries. It's been developed by the Japanese, but the Chinese can take over. They can take over not just selling the consumer side, but also the refining and the mining. And actually, that supply chain is of huge importance to the Chinese national interest and the interest of its companies. How does China work that out in 2000 and yet the West, specifically America, doesn't cotton on for a very long time. What explains that, do you think?
I think there are a couple of things. The Japanese would say it all went wrong when Sony started producing batteries in China. And I think that's part of the story. But you have to go a bit further back, actually. It really starts with the development of Shenzhen as a special economic zone. And they're trying to figure out products that they can make cheaply and at scale and take advantage of this huge migration of Chinese people who lived in agricultural areas to cities, basically. And so you had this very, very cheap supply of labor. And very early on, companies like BYD, which was founded in the early 90s, were basically putting together batteries by hand. They would have a human chain of workers putting together these lithium-ion batteries by hand, which is something that is done by robots in factories now and so on. So it was just so much cheaper than Japan. They were undercutting the Japanese every step of the way. And, the Koreans did it. Koreans did it from a more sort of high-tech way, and they actually surged ahead in the 2000s. But the Chinese just did it at such scale, and they poured in so much money into research, into universities, into, all this kind of R&D side of things. And at the same time, in the US, manufacturing was declining. Mining had become a dirty word. The U.S. mining industry had to go through a period of retrenchment, and I think it was necessary. I don't want to say that the U.S. has to have mining because at any cost, because U.S. mines were very, very dangerous places to be in the 1970s, and yet instead of reforming the industry, they just kind of got rid of it. Idaho, which is a big mining state, kind of completely obliterated its mining division at its university. I mean, it's pretty remarkable how much the US sort of flipped and just went completely away from that stuff. But that's also within a larger context of financialization of society and, Wall Street taking over, basically. I mean, it was very uncool, very unsexy for a long time. So the Chinese kind of were walking into a house that had already been built but had been evacuated, I suppose, or at least kind of was being sold for a very cheap price.
Are you familiar with the Giga Chad Xi Jinping meme?
No, I'm
not.
No,
you've not seen this one. No. Have you not seen this one?
No, I've not.
So it's like
I'm really bad on memes.
Xi, but 25, and he's got thick neck and bodybuilder, and it's do nothing, win.
Yeah.
And the story isn't that Chinese did nothing, but it was surprisingly easy to dominate in an industry where the US and its allies, i.e. Japan, had this extraordinary lead. I mean, you talk in the book about the US, now called Department of War, at the end of the Cold War having these huge strategic reserves of lithium, and actually they just give them all away because...
Or sold them at very, very, very low bargain basement prices.
Just to be clear as a journalist, they weren't giving lithium away. And it sounds like, to your point a moment ago, that this was really an expression of ideology. We don't need to make anything anymore. We don't need to build too much anymore. These things don't really matter too much. We have a big industrial base anyway, obviously. But, heavy industry and production isn't the future. US empire has prevailed. And they really took the rise off the ball about how do we build the technologies, how do we build the future in the 21st century? Because there was a fatalistic, deterministic conceit that was going to happen anyway. The future was theirs.
Well, it was also just software became, in the 2000s, everybody was looking at the rise of Google and Facebook and all this stuff. And Tesla is kind of the one outlier in a way because it's like, manufacturing is very important still. But Tesla is a different beast. I mean, it's obviously an industrial success story for Elon Musk, but it's, I wouldn't say it was like, that was the way that was the exception to the rule kind of thing. Most and to give Musk his credit, and that's something that I don't often do. I mean, he did see the way that the wind was blowing very early on. The fact is that the US, remains quite good at producing battery scientists. It still has, these small programs, but it just doesn't do it at scale. It doesn't do it sort of en masse. And, Argonne National Lab continues to make strides forward with, they created the nickel manganese cobalt cathode, which is one of the most powerful cobalt containing cathodes for a lithium ion battery. They created this other type of lithium ion battery that doesn't have cobalt, called the lithium ion phosphate LFP battery, which I talk about at the end of the book in the Western Sahara, and talk about how that supply chain is complicated as well. But yeah, I mean, I think there was just this idea in the 2000s that we were going to live in some magical digital future in which we were almost kind of separated from our bodies. And maybe that's the sort of political lie that, is most prevalent here, is that you're kind of separated from you're given this ability to be an angel or something like that. I think of there's a Doctor Who episode in which they sort of put everybody's heads and they live in space, kind of thing. It's a bit like that, or maybe it's Samuel Beckett or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there was this phase, and I bought a lot of it, I have to be honest, because it was very congruent with your quote unquote lived experience of the rise of the immaterial economy, and value is increasingly going to be in the immaterial economy and trademark, property rights, R&D, cultural cachet. This is where value was, and we bought this as an idea, particularly in Britain, for a really long time. And meanwhile, these guys are doubling down on just owning the supply chains for these ultra low margin, but ultra important industries: batteries, UAVs, cars.
But low margin is key to this. This is what's really important, is that it's very difficult to turn a profit if you're, Mr. Wall Street hedge fund manager or private equity manager or whatever it is. Somebody comes and says, "Look, I want you to fund my battery precursor material factory." I mean, where are you? You're left with a very, very small sliver of profit, and also if the commodity price turns against you, you're screwed. So it requires a huge amount of government investment, and that's what the Chinese have done. They've put a lot of government investment into this.
So that's true, and
or at least loaned a lot of money.
Yeah, low interest rates from state-owned bank or banks with huge amounts of state equity ownership. 100%. But, some of the individuals you talk about, so Wang Chuanfu, the BYD founder, Robin Zhang with CATL, another huge battery company.
And some people call it cattle.
Cattle.
Yeah.
Yeah, these companies are founded by, I know what you're saying, so there is clearly a role by the state, but in China they have this class of industrialists who seem quite eager to be involved in low-margin, large-scale industries, which obviously at a global scale are very profitable, but nobody in Britain, there aren't 21-year-old kids saying, you know what, I want to get into the lithium recycling game. So
some.
You think?
I met a young guy working at a lithium recycling thing in Scotland.
I'm not sure. Better than I will.
Yeah, I don't know.
The one guy. No, but my point is that, and again, it goes back to what you're saying about American capitalism financialization. Peter Thiel, right? His whole model, 0 to 1, is find an industry where you can have a monopoly, where you can build moats, and you don't have competitors. It's like the antithesis of this model where it's very competitive, it's very low margins, but if you have huge scale and low costs, you can win, you can dominate. And so it's kind of anathema to our understanding of what successful capitalism is meant to look like over the last 25 years.
Yeah.
Like nobody's going on Dragon's Den and saying, I want to start an ultra low margin, or Shark Tank in the US, I want to start an ultra low margin industry and be a global leader, because people are like, no, they want to be buy-to-let landlords, right?
Exactly. Well, I think that's I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, I think it's basically possible because of state intervention in China. I think that's really the magic to the source. And the fact is that when we're talking about Wang Chuanfu, when we're talking about Robin Zhang, they have such a connection to the Chinese Communist Party, and Chen Huihua, who's the Huayu guy, he is he'll go and speak regularly about battery production to the CCP. So, I mean, he's very active with as a kind of local representative kind of thing. So it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to disaggregate where private business is and where the kind of state sector begins. And what I found very interesting is that all Chinese people will say to you when you're talking about Huayu Cobalt, which is Chen Huihua's company, they go, "Oh, well, that's a private business." And it's like, no, it's really not. I mean, it's owned. The debt is owned by big Chinese institutions, and he, to a large extent, has been helped along by the Chinese state. It's a private business in that he was able to restore it from it being a failing business, or from being a middling business that had suffered through an economic crisis. He went to Congo and invested in these mines, and he invested in artisanal mining. This was really the thing that boosted it from being this kind of like, backyard refining factory into a place with a giant industrial campus and, world-shattering ambitions and thousands of employees and so on.
Yeah. It's so frustrating that we don't talk about this stuff more. I mean, I was reading about, in the Eva Du book, House of Huawei, the Huawei campus, and it has different themes and different buildings for the staff and libraries. And apparently, although I've never seen a photo of it online, this is what Eva Du says from the book, there is a fresco of the Battle of Waterloo.
Really?
So all these historical scenes. And it's so strange to me. We have no idea about any of this. You might see the occasional Wired magazine article about the Huawei, HQ or something. But it's just completely passing us by. And on the one hand, you've got people like me saying, well, it's very, it's communism, right? It's Chinese Communist Party. It's interesting. And then you have people on the right say, well, no, these are private businesses. It's capitalism. Capitalism won. And you say, well, hold on. Huawei we don't really know. It's seemingly owned by workers to some extent. And it's questionable. But then, like you say, with these firms, BYD, Cattle, they will have party cells. The leaders of these businesses are often party members, like Ren Zhengfei with Huawei. I don't know about these chaps. Maybe you can tell me that in a moment.
They are party members.
They're party members. They have party cells. They're party members. They have huge investment from state banks. They're market actors, but it's very strange if you want to call that capitalism, because it's clearly not the same system as we have here in Europe or across the Atlantic.
It's certainly not, yeah. I think it's really, also you have to remember that these people, when we were talking about Wang Chanfu and you're talking about Robin Zeng, these people came from the Iron Rice Bowl. They were professors or kind of state engineer characters who had this assurance, which was basically, from the 60s on, you had these Iron Rice Bowls, which were these positions which you would never go hungry, because the Chinese state would sort of guarantee you into retirement, that you would have a job and that you would have an income and so on. And they decided to go into something much more, entrepreneurial. But I think that the mentality never leaves you. I think you also still stay very close to the state. Chen Huihua is a different story. That's really somebody who was a bean sprout peddler and realized that you could refine metals in a shed, basically, and then started doing that on a bigger scale.
A bean sprout peddler.
A bean sprout peddler. And I think he also sold long-haired rabbits as well at one point.
So what is a bean sprout peddler?
He sold bean sprouts on the side of the road.
So these like grass kind of thing?
These little bean sprouts that you can eat, I guess, in Chinese cuisine.
It's kind of like a superfood in this country, right?
Yeah, maybe it probably is.
And now he's a billionaire. Again, there are so many of these stories, often it's really striking. You'll be reading about some individual in the Cultural Revolution, some crazed person who did some wild things in the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and maybe they went to prison or whatever, something bad happens to them, and then they're released, and since then they own like a $25 million fintech company or, refinery somewhere, and you think, Christ, this is just so alien to us. And these stories, which are increasingly defining the 21st century globally, these stories are at the heart of the technologies we use. Look at the the increase in sales of BYD cars this month, right? And yet, these aren't stories that are really being told.
But is it so different to kind of 19th century Britain?
Well, not at all, right?
Yeah.
But it's still, in a way, that's what I think makes it even stranger, because these are very romantic, immediately legible stories for our culture. This is the capitalism that we often look back on, especially the United States. But we don't hear about it, right? Beansprout peddler to billionaire, metals magnate. He's called the Steve Jobs of metals, right?
Well, that's Shang. What's he called? Guangdo, who's the Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs
apologies.
of metals.
And what did he used to do?
He was. I actually his origin story escapes me, but he was a kind of nickels trader, and he came more from within the state system, and then he was
okay.
So the beansprout peddler into kind of Cobalt. That's the real rags to riches story. Yeah,
Richard Branson can't compete with that.
Yeah,
and Wang Chunfu. So he is with BYD, increasingly huge battery producer. I think CATL is the world number one, right? And then BYD is number two for lithium-ion batteries. But obviously BYD also makes electric vehicles, other things as well. Tell me about them, because I think people are obviously going to see a lot more of BYD on streets in Britain over the next couple of years. So who are they? Who is he? How do they start?
So Wang Chunfu is also a rags to riches story as well. I mean, he's just somebody who was able to, with scholarships, and so he's started from an impoverished farming family. His parents died, and then with the aid of scholarships, he was able to end up in a very good university in sort of southern-ish part of China. And he was sent by that university in the early 90s to Shenzhen to figure out how the university could produce its own batteries. And then he realized that he could strike off at his own. He had a cousin who had some money, and so it's sort of unclear how, and he became the big first investor into this factory. They built this factory. They were building things by hand. And he was able to get some contracts with, some of the, I think it was Motorola. He was able to do some sort of cell phone contracts. But from very early on, I think he wanted to have an automotive industry. He wanted to have an automotive business. He bought a failing, and BYD, just for people who don't know, the letters didn't stand for anything when they first built it, when they first registered it as a company. It was supposed to be I think it was B, because it would be higher up in the list of names. So Chinese investors who were looking for a stock to just put some money on and gamble basically might put their money into it. But by the end of by the early 2000s, it was called Build Your Dreams. They sort of retrofitted that acronym basically. And what happened was that they bought a failing Chinese automaker, state, sort of like semi-state business as well, and they built that into what we know today as a colossus of electric vehicles. They weren't always an electric vehicle maker. They built petrol cars, but by 2012, people were saying, "Oh well, what about this BYD car?" And then Elon Musk turned around and said, "Have you seen their car?" Kind of like arrogantly dismissing it. And quite recently, he sort of admitted, he said, well, if there were not tariffs on the importation of BYD vehicles into the United States, they would completely eat Tesla. Mm. So it's quite remarkable how this guy has gone from, essentially nothing to building this business. At the same time, there's been a great deal of investment from the Chinese state. So, Bank of China will finance them, and low interest loans. The Bank of China will even break its own, as I show in the book, actually, for a mining deal, it will even break its own rules. It will break its own covenants because the pressure is so high to invest in these kind of like elite businesses for China. And I think that is set out very, very strongly in the 5-year plans. If you look at the most recent 5-year plan, I forget which number it is. It's 26 or something like that. The most recent 5-year plan says this is an industry that we need to be best in. And just zooming back in history, going back to your earlier question, where did this come from? I mean, people say this is because Chairman Mao at one point said people will be riding around China on electric bicycles, which I thought was quite fun. And some people go, oh well, you see, it's all Mao's dictums. I think that's probably a bit rich, but it's a good narrative, and I think they're probably pretty happy that he was able to predict something. And they were the big e-bike manufacturers, and e-bikes were much bigger in China in 2007 than they were here.
You've got a number here, actually. I think it's in 2011. I haven't got it written down, but it's in the book. In 2011, there were 140 million e-bikes in China. Yeah. This is 15 years ago.
15 years ago.
And here you still think of it as obviously not a cutting edge technology, but it's a luxury good. People don't just buy e-bikes. I mean, you have the ones that people just dump on the streets. But in terms of buying an e-bike, that's very unusual.
I came here on a Lime bike.
Yeah. Lime bikes. No, I know. But, I have a bicycle. I have a Bianchi, lovely bicycle. But I haven't, if I was to buy an e-bike, that's going to cost me £2,000. That's going to be an expensive thing to buy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there was 140 million of them there 15 years ago. Also, I like this thing about Mao. I saw a great tweet the other day, a post on X, and it was somebody on a high-speed train between two cities in China. And they got like a McDonald's or something at one of the stops because you can order it ahead. And then they had diarrhea on the toilet, and they said, this is what Mao wanted. High-speed train and fast food at one stop, and then like being sick, traveling at 400 kilometers an hour. This is the project of communism, which I found quite funny. So you're talking about the 5-year plans and China having these set industrial, scientific, technical kind of outcomes. Talk to me about the 863 program.
The 863 program, which was the Chinese technology development program, which they sort of set out in the 80s, and then they built up. It essentially was a way of setting goals for future technologies that they wanted to invest in, one of those being electric vehicles. And I think that was... They're very good at kind of defining their dreams and then sticking to what they're going to do, the Chinese. I mean, again, in the US, it will be like, oh, well, we want to do this. And then, that's one dream. And it kind of, a bunch of companies go out and do it. And they're successful, they're not successful. And then somebody else takes it away from them. And it's kind of the story with electric vehicles in China. And in outside of the US, and in China, actually what they'll do is they'll sort of doggedly stick with these things. And, the 860 program is sort of followed by the 10 cities, 1,000 electric vehicles program, which in the US, everybody says, you see, this is Chinese state planning and it's gone wrong.
It's top down. It can't work.
It can't work, yeah. Exactly. And you're like, okay. 5 years after this paper, which is like, it just failed. You're like, oh, well, that paper was wrong. Anyway, but I thought I think that's really interesting, is like setting a goal and just sticking to their guns until they get to that.
Is that because it's a one-party state, though? I mean, that's kind of hard to do in a multi-party democracy, especially one as adversarial as the US.
As the US, exactly, or the UK.
Or the UK. I mean, with PR systems, historically, Germany's been quite good at coalitions, rallying around a 25-year project. I mean, China's kind of undermining that argument too, but it does feel like the US and the UK systems, these first past the post adversarial systems, are basically tailor-made to not have long-term industrial strategy.
Well, I mean, they not necessarily tailor-made, but the fact is that politics have become such that these things are flashes in the pan. I mean, it's like there's an example in the book, which is A123, which is a battery maker that was supposed to be the battery maker for the auto industry. It was this kind of experimental business, and they were out in Detroit, They received a federal grant, not a huge amount of money. I mean, a sizable, I can't remember how much it was, obviously sizable, very much to you and me. But, in the scheme of these things, compared to the amount of investment that China's been making into, nothing. They went through some problems, and they had some issues with management. They had some issues with tech and so on. And after a couple of years, they were like, "Oh, this business has failed," and they had gotten stimulus money under Obama. And Mitt Romney goes, "See, this is why stimulus is wrong, and this is why government investment into projects is wrong, and the market should do everything." It's like, okay, then that entire company got shipped off to China. Their technology. There's a very funny story about this. Sorry, I'm chuckling about this, but their technology was taken over by the Chinese, and it was a company that had produced bed sheets and.
But there's a Chinese company that produced bed sheets, buys this US battery
maker, and the one of the former sort of top officials who talked to me about this said, "Yeah, well, so I went to the factory, and the guy gave me these bed sheets embroidered, I think, with horses, or they had a design of horses." He said, "This is a very strange gift. Why would you give me this?" And he didn't know that the factory had been a bed sheet factory, and then he goes. And then they go, "Oh, yes, well, because, 6 months ago, this was a bedsheet factory, but we're so happy to producing batteries now." So that's kind of like,
wow.
That's sort of what had happened. And, I'm sure that there were many casualties along the way. The Japanese always say that the Chinese are able to do this because they don't care how many batteries blow up. They don't care, the accidents that happen in the factories. They don't care. And that's probably, the bad side of it, and there is a bad side. There is an environmental factor to all of this, but it is also kind of amazing to see how that has paid off. Now, I don't think that would be possible and I'm glad that's not possible as well in Europe or in the US, because at least there is a culture of safety and there is a culture of moving responsibly. However, I think that in the end of the day, people don't want to make any kind of people don't want to proceed either in the safe or the unsafe way here. They don't want to proceed in the unsafe way because they're worried about liability, and they don't want to proceed in the safe way because there are no margins, as we were talking about earlier. So we've gone sort of into this strange netherworld in which everything comes from another place and we don't really think about it. And that's very convenient for the tech companies. That's very convenient for Apple, for example. They don't have to deal with a factory floor in which people are getting their hands stuck in machines. They don't have to deal with where are these minerals coming from. I mean, for many years they didn't have to deal with that. And yet it's still happening, and it's still happening around the world. And I think that, that's something that the left should be concerned about. And I don't think it's a correct way to think about it, saying, "Oh, it's not happening here, so we shouldn't think about it." It's, this is not a problem for us. But that's where we are.
I mean, that can come across as sort of politically worthy or puritanical. And I don't think that. But when you think that, look, I think 9 out of 10 solar panels globally are made in China, 70% of lithium-ion batteries, industry after industry, so much stuff is now coming from China. It's such a profound form of alienation that we have literally no relationship to the goods that we depend on. I mean, it's extraordinary. I go to National Trust site with my wife and a daughter at the weekend, and I'll try and get my daughter a book. It's the National Trust. The book is made in China. The book. In the National Trust, I'm not talking about a lithium-ion battery. I'm not talking about a phone. I'm talking about a book, a bloody book. And I think, so the book's £6. Surely a British consumer would be happy to pay £7 for that same book to be made in the UK. But you're right, like the margins are so low that nobody wants to do it. So I think it's partly, you said it's partly about state involvement. I think that's obviously true. That's almost all of it. There's also a little bit of a cultural element there, which is an outgrowth of decades of neoliberalism, financialization. These are just not things that you want to do, which is interesting for me because I'm half Iranian. And for men of my dad's age, in their 50s and 60s, using your hands and brain is very prestigious. Engineering, medicine, just so prestigious in a way, particularly engineering.
I'm half Greek, so I understand this.
Yeah,
Same thing.
It's just the idea of being a cognitive but blue-collar worker, for some reason, just seen as very manly and very high status, whereas it just isn't here, which I find, again, really, really interesting. In terms of we don't like to think about it, this is kind of going back to the politics of all this. As you say on the front of the book, the dirtiest supply chain on earth. Is it dirtier than oil? Because you had recently Scott Bessent in the US in the Trump administration saying that Chinese EVs are basically coal-powered cars. That's how we should look at them. Is he right?
I mean, to some extent, yes. I mean, if you go to, Chinese EVs and Teslas, if you go to these mines in Indonesia, you are sitting next to a smokestack belching out coal 24/7 into the sky. You have these islands, these green islands, which are the focus of like colonial machinations between the Dutch and the English, trying to get spice routes and so on. But at least, they were very violent, and there's this horrendous sort of history of this stuff. But at least these islands had been, forgotten for many years, and they'd grown up. They'd become forested again, and now suddenly there are these scars on the landscape, and it's just being done in the most environmentally polluting way. You go to the sea by these mines; it's bright red or this kind of murky red, the Guardian did an analysis of the water, and it just said it had some of the highest levels of nickel, and it had some of the highest levels of heavy metals in the water. So I do think it's an incredibly dirty industry, and I think that the mining and the refining and the shipping it around the world, all of these things are really, really dirty. And then the thing that I think takes it into becoming the dirtiest supply chain on earth is the corruption and the pure pure sort of brutality with which a lot of it is extracted. I mean, you just don't have children drilling for oil. That's just not how it works. Of course, you had children mining coal back in the day, but it's just a different thing. This is happening in countries where there is just very, very little oversight. There is very little supervision. Democratic Republic of the Congo being the key example. But as I show in the book, there are examples of neo-colonialism, wage slavery, exploitation. I mean, just the list goes on and on and on. And it's just going into the pockets of some of the wealthiest people in the earth.
You talk about a place called Kolwezi. I mean, this is an extraordinary story. It sounds nightmarish. Tell me a little bit about it.
Kolwezi itself, you would not want to, it's been described. The fact is that a lot of journalism has happened, or a lot of the journalists who've gone down there go in the dry season because it's easier to get around the roads. And so in other accounts, it's been described as this blasted landscape and blah, blah. And that's true around the mines. But the fact is that, during the rainy season, it's actually very lush and verdant. And the Katangese have an amazing relationship. The Katangese being the southern Congolese, different groups of people, the Lunda, the Yeke, the Luba. They have this amazing relationship with trees and with nature. And that is slowly being stripped away because of industry and because of mining. What has sort of arisen in its stead is this sort of urban sprawl around these different mines, and so it's not as we think of it. A mine is, in some cases, of course, in Europe, you do have mines right next to towns, but broadly we think of the mines being a distinct place to the urban geography. Here, it's the towns sort of surround the mines, and the Congolese will always say to you, well, the Belgians built their cities on top of mines because they wanted to stop us mining the richest parts of the city, and they say it's under every neighborhood. And I start one of the chapters with, there is the story of Kasulo, which is a suburb of Kolwezi. Basically, you have to, it's sort of 20 minutes outside of town, but I mean the town sort of sprawls up to Kasulo, and somebody was digging a latrine. And he struck a vein of cobalt, and he dug, so he didn't want other people to see, he dug a hole under his house and started mining out the cobalt. And by the time that that people started hearing him sort of chipping away, he'd already made quite a bit of money. And suddenly the entire town, obviously you're in one of the poorest countries in the world, the entire town starts mining into the ground. So the entire place becomes like sort of Swiss cheese. We've got these holes where people are digging out these minerals. And what's really interesting about that is that it gets declared an artisanal exploitation zone by the governor and then sold off to a Chinese company, the same Chinese company that's owned by the former beansprout peddler, which is really interesting because you kind of see in the cycle of that artisanal exploitation, and that, which I say with big quotation marks around, or what the governor will call anarchic exploitation, which then goes to being regulated, but in such a way that nobody could ever really properly live off what was coming out of the ground. I mean, they're basically being paid minimum, survival wages to mine that plot, and everybody's homes are moved off to another place. And the interesting thing, when I walked through this other place, this kind of little Potemkin village that the Chinese company had created, I said to them, look, what's this on the ground? I saw some kind of like rocks, and they said, oh, well, that's probably minerals. I said, oh, well, do you think they'll come and mine here? They, oh, well, we'll get kicked off this land too. We'll be moved. So I think that there's a lot more stories like this in the pipeline. And unless the Congolese government steps up and applies its own mining laws, it actually has very good mining laws, funnily enough, Congo, which they revised in 2018 to be more equitable for the country. They're just not applied. That's the problem. And so it's not a case of like going over and saying, we are the West and we know how you should behave. It's a question of saying, look, you've got this great law, apply it, and maybe don't make some of your buddies so rich. I think that's a big question there.
I mean, the default response of lots of the left, or the radical left, to this sort of stuff is I hate it, by the way, and I'm sure some people in our audience will really violently disagree with me. I hate it. Extractivism. We can't extract anything. Well, I don't know where you begin and end with extractivism. When I pull a carrot up from the soil, I'm extracting it. What would you want me to do with that? So, they would say we need an anti-extractivist politics. This just has to stop. And actually, from a utilitarian point of view, if we had Nigel Farage watching this, he'd say, see, actually, it's more ethical to be getting our energy from North Sea oil and gas than it is from exploiting these poor children in the Democratic Republic of Congo. By the way, there's some truth to that. But of course, what we know, and we've not really touched upon it, is that these technologies are critical in the long term, managed properly, which is not happening, in moving to a world where we reduce CO2 emissions and planetary warming is lower than it otherwise would be. So presumably you think that extractivism critique is stupid. I'm not going to ventriloquize you. You disagree with it?
I don't think it's extractive. Look, Terrio Francos's extractivist critique is, I think, a good critique because it brings together what we see as the colonial skeleton, which undergirds a lot of this stuff. I mean, you look at the way that the companies are structured, and somebody was telling me about Pakistan today, about on the border with Iran, about this mine that he was involved with, and he said, look, You should go there because it's very similar to Congo. The person that we were speaking to and was the intermediary for the local community is not really an intermediary for the local community. He is the descendant. He is a wealthy person who is the descendant of the British political agent for that part of Pakistan. Well, I guess it was British India at the time. So it's very interesting how there is a kind of colonial extractivist structure. And I think that extractivism, the idea that you only interact with a place based on an extractive industry and not to build it up, not to say, look, you need to also be manufacturing and you need to be, making your food and that kind of thing and having a mixed economy. That I think is a very fair use of the term extractivism. Where it obviously goes completely awry is this idea where you can't extract anything. It's like, well, everything that we use, everything that we eat, everything that we, anything has either been in the ground as a metal, as a mineral, or something like that, or has been farmed. So you need to use things on the earth. I mean, maybe there's also a wonderful utopian world that we can all live in tree houses, but you still have to use the trees somehow.
It feels kind of related to that, again, that politics of immaterialism. I think actually the idea that you oppose pulling anything from the earth is itself a representation of, you are fundamentally alienated, as am I, in London in 2026. You're fundamentally alienated from that kind of production. But I think...
But it's a fantasy. I mean, it's the fruitarian ideal, or I don't know. I think that has been romanticized and, by people on both sides of the political spectrum and very apolitical people as well.
Yeah. I mean, my view is just, you want public ownership of this stuff and you want trade unions and you want laws that are actually enforced. Yeah. And you want the workers who take risks to be paid really well, right? You want the market to reflect that, although necessarily wouldn't be the market because the state's involved.
But the Congolese government does it very, the law does it well, because what it does is it says, look, this part should be for X part of the local community. This part should be for Y part of the local community. This should be for the city, and this should be for the province, and this should be for the state itself. And all of that money, and it's so worthy. And most of that money goes into a private bank account. It's paid in by the mining companies, and they say, we paid the money. Fair enough. They paid their taxes. They did their job. Into the place that we've been told to pay it into. And for some reason, the Congolese government is able to say, look, you have to pay it into this bank. And suddenly that money doesn't go into the pockets of the people who live next to where those mines are. Suddenly that money disappears into a shadow network of people who are very close to power. And that's really the problem. And that is illegal. And that is the aspect of things that needs to be straightened out. Because if people can actually benefit from the things that are close to them, they will, and I go into this right at the end of the book. There's a community called Bunkea. There are a lot of sort of kingship structures within that part of the world, and some of them are kind of completely without power, and some actually do still have some power. And this is a local king who's basically been very, very good about going to Kinshasa, the capital, and saying, we need this money to come to our community, and this is the law. And instead of pocketing it for himself as he gets it to go back to his local community, then he's able to build things like roads and universities and farms. And, he's hired farming experts from around Africa to come and teach people how to, properly harvest crops and so on. So it's a model for the rest of the country, but it requires, somebody being there ready to go and advocate. It's a huge amount of work.
This is why, I'm not a Maoist, but I have a soft spot for Mao. With my colleague Michael Walker, we have disagreements. I think Deng Xiaoping, arguably most important figure of the 21st century, not the 20th, even though he died in the 20th century. But what Mao achieves Obviously, stupid, nonsensical things like the Cultural Revolution, although the one-child policy kills more people. Cultural Revolution, just bizarre, frankly. Great Leap Forward, again, bizarre. Having
murderous and
the thing is,
evil.
the Great Leap Forward. The thing is, it was almost worse than being murderous because lots of people died out of just stupidity. We're going to have targets for killing sparrows, and all of a sudden, because Mao thought he was an agronomist, the whole food supply chain of whole regions just collapses. The whole thing about melting steel in these communally owned steel foundries, just stupidity. So it's a bit of both, but. There was a project which was, we're going to have, the nation first, serve the people. Of course, there is corruption and whatnot, but you establish an integrated national state, again, with one language that has massive downsides in terms of minority languages. But there is another world where China, and this is what an apologist for Mao would say, I'm not an apologist for Mao, but I think there's something to it, that China would look like the DRC if you didn't have the Chinese Communist Party, or maybe even the KMT would have done something similar. But the point is, the China of the early 1900s and late 19th century was kind of similar. It was being, just pillaged by foreign interests.
Warlordism.
Exactly. It's very, very similar. No centralized state able to coordinate, no centralized state able to protect or serve people.
Have you read the story of Two Gun Cohen?
I haven't. Two Gun Cohen, no.
He was a sort of mercenary. Well, he was sort of very pro kind of like proto KMT character, and he sort of went around like as a hired gun, almost like Wild West style, going around these different Chinese warlords, kind of being their bodyguard kind of thing, which was amazing. And you really get an insight into how fractured that country was.
Yeah.
And very much to do with the way that the British had been during the Opium Wars.
Yeah.
I mean, that is one of the great unsung tragedies of the 19th century.
Horrific.
People the potato famine, the murder of 10 million people in Congo, and the Opium Wars. Yeah. Two of those things are the Brits.
Yeah. The first Opium War, it's the biggest seizure of narcotics in human history. They dilute it and then dump it at sea, and then, that starts a war. But I wasn't going to ask this, but and I'm not suggesting that what China is doing in Congo is the same as what the Brits did in the opium. I mean, it's different, right? It's just different. It has a veneer of legality in a different way.
Yeah.
But are there not voices in China saying, hold on, the French and the Brits and the Russians did this to us in the 19th century. Now we're doing it to Africa?
No, because the Chinese see their involvement in Africa as altruistic. There was a 1964 speech by Zhou Enlai in which he outlined China's principles for foreign aid. This was, let me remind you, you had these Maoist rebels in Central Africa going around and basically wiping out the intelligentsia for what it was worth. The Belgians had left very few educated, university-educated people and so on in Congo. But basically anybody who could read or write was being murdered in Eastern DRC by Chinese trained and equipped people. This is after the killing of and murder of Patrice Lumumba by Belgian-backed stooges in Katanga. It's all in the book. It's very complicated, but there were also these Maoist rebels in the east. They hated the central state, and then they were there, kind of sowing their own kind of chaotic legacy. But nevertheless, when Zhou Enlai made the speech in Accra, he said, "Look, China was not trying to trap these people in debt; that they wanted to support the dignity of the African worker and so on." And I think China has had a very, very mixed record, including betraying people that it formerly worked with. It went from supporting these rebels against the dictator Mobutu Sese Seko to then supporting Mobutu. And they were nothing if not pragmatic. So you say to Chinese people, and I've said this several times, what is China doing in Africa? Does it feel like colonialism to you? And the point of that, of including that in the book, is that many Africans do see it as that. There's a big narrative within Africa. It is something quite similar to the use of the British East India Company to economically colonize India. And I would say that the Chinese see it in a totally different way. They see it as, we are helping Africans. We are helping this country, this continent that has been so beaten down, get on its feet. And that has been the narrative for a long time. And there's a good book on this. I think it's called China's African Safari. And it's reflected in the way in which Chinese people are in Africa, funnily enough. They do kind of come with this, and I'm not saying that people from the US or from Britain don't come with the same kinds of things. And look, I came as a journalist as well. I mean, there's the whole bunch of problematic things there as well. And there are obviously Chinese actors who do come, but I think the vast majority of people are still stuck in a mentality that is, this is what this is what Xu Enlai said that we're doing, and we are doing it, and this is helpful development, and this is China helping Africa up off its knees.
A civilizing mission.
Which feels very much like a civilizing mission, isn't it? A civilizing mission being the quote from Heart of Darkness.
I mean, there's some truth to that. I'm sure that, the infrastructure being built by Chinese firms in Africa is really extraordinary, And I love that quote about, when Western leaders come here, you give us a lecture. When Chinese leaders come here, they build a railroad. Again, there's some truth to that. But I wonder, is international socialism, international solidarity necessarily going to explain employing child laborers in cobalt mines? I suspect not. No, that's a bit of a stretch. I have one last question for you. Ed Miliband, with rolling out solar panels and lithium-ion batteries in this country, the infrastructure basically for a post-carbon energy system, electricity system, I should say, post-carbon grid, which we're getting towards. He would say it's so much more important that we have homegrown energy. But given everything you've said about the dependence of this technology being fabricated elsewhere, the minerals being mined from elsewhere, is that just nonsense? Is this anything but homegrown?
I mean, it is anything but homegrown. But I think you hit the nail on the head with the question. You answered your own question. I mean, I think the fact is that, until Cornish lithium is on its feet and that Cornish lithium is processed and, there's some kind of equitable trade of cobalt for, I don't know, British beef or something like that. And, there's some kind of way in which this really fits into the economy as a sort of equitable supply chain, which I just don't see happening anytime soon, I'm afraid. Then it is anything but homegrown energy. It is energy that comes from it is created using things that are very, very polluting and come from far away.
Nick, pleasure talking to you.
Aaron, really, really lovely speaking to you.
Thanks for coming on Downstream.
Great.